Hey guys, welcome to today's class. I had some emergency last minute travel, so just recording today's session. We're going to cover chapter 18, and then I'll sign some questions from that chapter as well. That'll be due from a week from today. If anyone has any questions, just feel free to shoot me a text or an email. You guys can reach me either way. So we'll get right to it. I will mention, just this past Friday, interesting day in the markets. They were down pretty significantly, a couple percent, but it was actually the worst day of the year. Also shows how maybe spoiled the market's gotten, where a day that's a little bit north of -2% is pretty scary. But it was also a light day in the market because it was effectively Black Friday. A lot of portfolio managers and traders aren't working on that day. So that was an interesting observation. I don't think this new variant is anything serious when it comes to economic activity. It's kind of more of the same. We'll probably have more scares like this, but that's usually what they tend to be. So we'll get right to it. So chapter 18 is going to talk about economic rent. And that's defined, and the factors that impact its value are explored. Then we're going to look at the price of money, or interest rates, and how interest rates are determined, along with using the price of money, loanable funds theory. Along with interest rates, we investigate present value and the future value of money. Last, we will examine the role of profits in the allocation of resources. There we go. Next, economic rent is just shown right here. Some of the keywords: interest, loanable funds theory, time value of money, the role of interest rates, economic profit, as well as income shares. Economists use the term rent to represent economic rent. Economic rent is the price paid for the use of the land and other natural resources that are completely fixed in total supply. This fixed overall total supply distinguishes rental payments from wage, interest, as well as profits. For all practical purposes, the supply of land is perfectly inelastic, resulting in a vertical supply curve. Because the supply of land is fixed, demand is the only active determinant of land rent. The demand for land is driven by productivity of the land, the demand for the products produced on the land, and prices of other resources that are combined with the land, along with the location of land. Given the fact that land is perfectly inelastic supply, there is no incentive payments associated with land. Economists therefore consider land rents to be surplus payments. Another thing to consider here, especially during the pandemic, raw land actually dramatically increased in value during the pandemic. And that's because people found more use for it, right? Before, I've heard things like a $15,000 plot of land in Colorado, started to go as high as 100 grand. So there's that vertical supply along with the demand. And all it's saying here is that, supply is fixed, and it's a function of demand, which will determine prices. Because the supply of land is perfectly inelastic, demand is the sole determinant of land rent. An increase in land demand from D2 to D1, or a decrease in the demand from D2 to D3 will cause considerable change in rent. The amount of land will always stay the same. If the demand is very weak relative to supply, land will be a free good, commanding no rent. You go back, ancient history almost, but when they were first settling California, you got free land for moving out here, or out there to California. Why? Because they were just trying to incentive people to move out there, and there was no other incentive to do it, so they were giving the stuff away. Is private land ownership fair? I think all of us in the classroom would say so. In a capitalist society, it allocates a scarce land resource. Invisible hand is a movement of the economy, and it will then, by selling land, it will allocate it hypothetically to its highest value use. So socialists have often argued that land is a gift of nature, and therefore land rents are unearned incomes, since the owners of the land who rent it out produce nothing, and therefore land rents could be heavily taxed and not reduce the supply of land. However, supporters of private land ownership have argued that private ownership forces owners to consider the opportunity cost and use the land for its best use, and actually results in surplus payments from society's standpoint. Markets are used to reflect changes in value of land based on new technologies, economic growth. If land were owned by the government, it would be very difficult for the government to identify the best use of the land. So, all these things say, the market or the invisible hand will help determine the best use for all this stuff. In the US, criticism of rental payments produced what was referred to as the single tax movement in the late 19th century. Supporters of this movement held that economic rent could be heavily taxed without diminishing the available supply or reducing the efficiency with which is allocated. One thing the book doesn't mention too is, the pride of land ownership, right? If you lived in an area that was full of renters, the neighborhood would look significantly different if it was full of owners, right? Just because if something's broken, the landlord, and you're living there as a renter, the landlord might want to keep that in a state of semi-disrepair for longer than an owner would. Next, interest. That's the price paid for the use of money. Interest rates are basically how we determine the cost of money, like what's money worth. If our interest rates are going up, that's usually a sign that the value of our currency is rising. If interest rates are going down, that's usually something that will cause our money to be worth less. So interest is the price paid for the use of money, typically stated as an annual percentage. It's important to remember that money is not an economic resource, since you cannot directly produce any goods and services with it. Borrowers value money for what it can purchase. The interest rate is determined by several factors. First and foremost, interest rates reflect the risk that the money will not be repaid. The greater the chance of default, the higher the rate of interest you'll be charged. The time length of the loan or its maturity also affects the rate. The longer the loan is outstanding, the higher the likelihood the rent will be, etc. The loan amount will also have an effect on interest rates. Smaller loans usually have a higher rate. And finally, taxability of interest income may be a factor. So in the US, many borrowers for a mortgage get a tax deduction for the interest paid. So it actually gives you an incentive. The government actually is giving you an incentive to own property. Here's a table of various interest rates often referred to in the media from February 15th, 2019. So you see the 20-year bond, the 90-day treasury bill. The 90-day treasury bill, it's about at 1.55%, I believe, as of today. You see that in 2019, it was at 2.43. That was pre-pandemic, before the government cut rates. And you see the rates cut via our 1.55 rate we see today. That also means, all these are kind of linked together. So you see here the 30-year mortgage, 4.34. Well, surprise, surprise, it's significantly closer to 3 today because of everything else. Auto loans are a little interesting because oftentimes the vehicle maker will subsidize those loans. Loanable funds theory. The loanable funds theory of interest explains the interest rate on any particular type of loan in terms of supply and demand for funds available for lending in a loanable fund market that exists for a particular type of loan. So there's different types of loans. So even the home mortgage market, any mortgage, I believe, under about $1 million is just a regular mortgage. Above that is considered a jumbo loan. Jumbo loans generally charge, I've seen sometimes higher rates. I know that's contradictory to what I said before about the size of the loan, but it also more has to do with the quality of credit. Most loans will be obtained through some kind of financial institution, such as banks. Banks will pay interest to savers to attract the loanable funds, and in turn will lend those funds to businesses or mortgages. The institution profits by charging a higher rate to the borrower than they pay to the saver. Anything that causes households to save more will shift the supply curve rightward. So anything that causes higher savings will effectively bring down interest rates because more money is available to lend. What happened during the pandemic, right? There was increased savings. A decline in savings will shift the supply curve leftward. Changes in demand come about when rate of return on potential investment increases or decreases. The Federal Reserve also controls the amount of bank activity and thus influences a wide variety of rates. They don't control rates, but they can certainly significantly influence them. Another visual of the loanable fund market, the upward sloping curve for loanable funds in a specific lending market reflects the idea that at higher interest rates, households will defer more of their present compensation, save more, making more funds available for lending. The downward sloping demand curve for loanable funds and state market indicates that businesses will borrow more at a lower rate of interest. Surprise, surprise. If the financing is more attractive, you'll take more money or take a risk in the first place on a loan. Time value of money. This is a concept that many of you might have seen before. Money is more valuable the sooner it is obtained. Why? Because you're able to earn interest and compound interest. I often, a fun example for this is you think about the lottery. You win $1 million, they'll pay you over 30 years, the $1 million, right? Or they'll give you a lump sum of $600,000 today. That could be an attractive option because then you get you do the math and you find out what the discount rate is. Like what's the present value, assuming I do the lump sum or I take it over 30 years. Also, taking it over 30 years limits your investment opportunities, right? So interest rate is central to understanding the time value of money, or the concept that a specific amount of money is more valuable to a person the sooner it is obtained. Compound interest is a total interest that accumulates over time on money that is placed into an interest-bearing account. Future value is the amount which some current amount of money will grow as interest compounds over time. Present value is today's value of some amount of money to be received in the future. Money has a time value because of the potential for effectively compound interest. So you're seeing a visual here of a compound interest table, future value, present value, and you're seeing the effect of a 10% rate, which is, to be honest with you, in the investing world, getting a 10% rate annually is pretty high. The table illustrates the power of compound interest. As each period goes by, the interest earned is added to the value, and the interest for the next period is calculated on the beginning plus the interest earned to date. So the role of interest rates, that's the relationship to total output, allocates capital and R&D spending. So lower equilibrium interest rates encourages businesses to borrow more for investment. So no surprise that debt is so high right now for corporations and governments. Why? Interest rates are low. It's attractive. This is why the system is the way it is. Lower interest rates make it more attractive to take out loanable funds, allowing you to take more risk at effectively lower cost. This is also no surprise that small business startups and ownership is, reaching relative highs because, the magic of interest rates is encouraging people to do so, combined with technology and a few other things. Since interest rates are effectively prices for money, they allow for an allocation of the available supply of loanable investment funds to investment projects that have expected returns at or above the interest rate of borrowed funds. So if I start a project and I could earn 10%, but I need to borrow at 3, well, that's an attractive investment, right? Borrow at 3, earn 10. You would earn the spread, almost acting like a bank, if you're viewing your project as a bank. Decisions to spend on R&D will also be influenced by the interest rate. So lower interest rates, meaning it's easier to obtain funds. This is also why biotech stocks usually do well when interest rates are going down instead of up. The real interest rate is the rate of interest expressed in the purchasing power, adjusted for inflation. It is the real interest rate that affects investment and R&D decisions. Many states have passed what are referred to as usury laws, which are price ceilings on maximum interest rates. So they try to cap those out to protect the consumer. Short-term nominal interest rates of selected nations. So some countries are naturally more risky. They might have their own economic issues. South Africa, Mexico, it's also a riskier environment. So when you think about why a country might have a higher level of interest, I'm not too sure about Iceland in this example, but you see more developed countries have lower levels of interest rates. You don't see too many emerging market countries here, because effectively the risk is pretty low in developed markets. This past week, though, I think in Turkey, short-term rates surged above, like, I think 20% or 15%, because their inflation is now above 20%. Excuse me. Economic profit. It's important to remember that economists define profit very narrowly. It's not the same way as accountants. Accountants define profit as what is left over after the bills are paid. The economists define profit as what is left after both the explicit, the bills, and implicit costs have been covered. Implicit costs are the monetary income the firm sacrifices when it's using the resources that it owns, rather than supplying those resources to the market. So if you could earn 7% by using this project, or you can earn 2% by putting it in the bank, your implicit cost is that 2%. The economic profit flows to the individuals and motivates them to provide economic resources known as entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur gets what's left. That's the residual revenue after all costs. A normal profit included have been subtracted from that total value. Whoops, one ahead here. Some financial risks. There are some insurable risks and some uninsurable risks. Entrepreneurs face significant financial risks, which fall into two different categories. Insurable ones, which is possible to buy insurance for, and uninsurable risks, for which is not. Uninsurable risks fall into four main categories. The first includes general economic environments, such as a recession. Second is change in structure of the economy, like think about going from online shopping from going to the mall. Consumer changes in taste. Look at milk consumption over the last 20 years. There's much less aptitude to drink cow milk and much more aptitude to drink other forms of milk. Next, changes in government policy, such as newly instituted regulation, are another source of uninsurable risk. So if you started a flavored vape store in Massachusetts, you're out of luck. The government changed the rules on you. You're probably out of business. So those are some of the risks that are insurable and uninsurable. Sources of economic profit. Source of profit. Sorry, let me start again. Profit as compensation for bearing uninsurable risk. You're the one taking the uninsurable risk of starting this business, running an airline, opening a small business that's local. You have a few sources of economic profit here, and profit does serve as compensation for the entrepreneur for personally taking on the uninsurable risk. In exchange for making sure that everyone else gets paid if things go wrong, the entrepreneur gets to keep the firm's profit when things go right. There are three main ways which the entrepreneur can generate economic profits. They can create a popular new product that people desire. They can implement more efficient production methods for existing products, or they can create and maintain a monopoly for their product. In the real world, entrepreneurs and economic profits are distributed to more than just entrepreneurs who start their own business. In many cases, businesses become incorporated, and then they have many millions of individuals who purchase ownership via shares, and they get to share in the risk of and the reward. Think of those highly successful companies such as Microsoft or Walmart. Their profits are shared by many besides the original entrepreneurs who started the companies. These profits send signals through the marketplace as to how society wants to use its scarce resources by investing in profitable companies and allowing those companies that are no longer able to compete, think about like Sears, for example, to go out of business. This chart's from 2017. It shows the functional distribution of U.S. incomes. Labor by far holds a dominant role in the U.S. economy. Even narrowly defining labor as just wages and salaries, labor receives 70% of all income earned by Americans in a typical year. Adding proprietors' incomes brings the total to 80%. The remaining 20% goes to capitalists in the form of rents, interests, and corporate profits. That 20% though, ends up being a small number of people, right, earning all these economic rents. Last word, determine the price of credit. So there are many different forms of borrowing, and interest paid on those loans can sometimes be difficult to determine. It's important for an individual to pay attention to exactly how interest rates are being calculated. Two pieces of legislation, the Truth in Lending Act 1968 and the Truth in Savings Act in 1991, have attempted to clarify interest rate charges and payments for consumers. Just borrower beware, right? So when you're, whether you're getting a car loan or a car lease, you want to know, a question I always ask is, effectively, how much above the prime rate are you paying, right? The prime rate is their best rate. And you can definitely ask the lender how many points or, percentages you're paying above that prime rate. So that's always a fair question to ask. So thank you guys for putting up with today's remote session. I look forward to seeing you all on Thursday. Have a great day.